The newsagents.
It has been a week of ritual bloodletting for the Labour Party. Faction against faction, chaotic day after day, where they couldn't even seem to decide whether one single MP would be allowed to stand or not.
And it's really hit them in the polls because they've never looked stronger. Labour's lead over the Tories is as big as when it started. Keir Starmer's approval rating has never been higher against Rishi Sunak. Everything is looking as though the worst week ever has actually been just fine. Welcome to the newsagents. It's John.
It's Lewis.
It's Emily.
And bloody hell, all three of us on a Sunday. I mean, what's going on?
We're through the looking glass now.
Well, here we are all together at the end of Labour's terrible week. And as we say, never been looking so good for them. But there are bits to deconstruct from a week where it didn't go according to plan. The whole fight with Diane Abbott seemed to kind of spin out of control. And yet, as we get to the end of the week, I wonder whether the deal that was originally stitched up at the beginning, that Diane Abbott would get the whip back but wouldn't stand in the election, is what the end result is going to be.
I think that's right. And I think the widespread expectation from everybody I'm speaking to is that obviously it is now Diane Abbott's to decide. We went from a position when we were talking about it all last week, John, where we were told constantly, again and again, this is a matter for the NEC. The NEC, the National Executive Committee of the Labour Party, will be deciding next Tuesday. On Friday afternoon, it turns out Keir Starmer says, after all, actually she is able to stand. Turns out maybe it wasn't entirely within the gift of the NEC after all. But the weirdness is that I think we might well end up in the place where this all began, which was that there would be an elegant exit for Diane Abbott, where she ends up getting sent to the Lords, which is being reported on in the Sunday Times. And I wouldn't be surprised to see if Diane Abbott said something like, after all the bad blood that there's been, I think it's time now for me to step back. The only one thing I think that is set against that potentially is that Diane Abbott is a highly, highly factional creature. She's a proper factional operator. She will know that if she goes now, that her seat will go to a key Keir Starmer ally, and she will be cognizant of that. But in the end, it might well be that she ends up stepping away anyway. It is such a Labour Party thing to spend an entire week knocking seven bells out of each other about something upon which actually fundamentally you were basically all agreed in the first place.
I think this was always about dignity, wasn't it, at heart? This idea that the men were sort of locked in their rooms deciding what the first female black MP would be doing. And I don't know if Diane knew whether she was going to stand again or not. It might be that she still doesn't know if she's going to stand again or not. But I thought there was a very elegant way out from her colleague and clearly friend, Shami Chakrabarti, who'd been very vocal on the newsagents with us a couple of weeks ago when this first surfaced, saying, you know what, she ought to be allowed to stand. And right now, Shami has kind of stepped back and said, it's Diane's choice. But I think there was always a sense that this supreme loyalty of who was allowed to stand in that Keir circle was actually not a very attractive position, that you want to have a broad church, that you want to see people who disagree with the leader. Because if ultimately the majority is going to be as big as the polls currently suggest, you don't want to have a whole load of people who think exactly the same way as the person at the centre, do you?
Well, you do if you're Keir Starmer.
Yeah, Keir Starmer, you'd say, yes, please. Yeah, I'd love that. That would be absolutely marvellous.
How high do I want you to jump? Well, probably about this high.
For how long?
Totally. I think that's right, though. In the long term, there is a real argument about whether doing what they've done actually, in the end, limits the kind of intellectual bandwidth of a political party and its roots as well, and how far they go and how wide they go. There's always a trade-off, right? You can have intellectual and political coherence. You have all your MPs singing to your tune. That's fine. But when push comes to shove and when things start to get really tough, there is a feeling, certainly from someone on the Labour right, John McTurnan's written about this week, a feeling that perhaps the Labour Party and Keir Starmer have become too interested, too obsessed in seeing off potential threats to their right and not worried enough about what might happen on the left or on the progressive left and nurturing that coalition in the way that, say, Biden has done in the future when they get into government.
Also, it's very useful to have a few left-wingers who create some noise, and if they threat to rebel and you've got a big majority, you can swat them down and you show that you're tough and in charge. It's just the manner in which, as Emily says, that they've gone about dealing with Diane Abbott was just so lacking in elegance and dignity, and was so ham-fistedly handled with that idiotic briefing to the Times, that no wonder people like Shami Chakrabarti and friends around Diane Abbott were furious. But I thought it was interesting when Shami Chakrabarti was with Laura Kunsberg this morning on BBC One, that there was, you just sensed, Diane Abbott's not going to stand.
I hope that she will now, after this sometimes sordid week of unauthorised, anonymous briefings by overgrown schoolboys in suits with their feet on the table and maybe watching too much West Wing but not taking on its more progressive values. I hope, and by the way, I hope they remember it's supposed to be country first, not faction first. I hope she will take some time to consider, you know, what she wants to do, and that's literally what I've suggested to her as her friend, and I hope that's what she's going to do.
So obviously one of the costs for this week has been, which we've been talking about all week, has been that Labour has not been able to get its message out because it has been so distracted by these internal problems. As we've said and we're going to discuss, doesn't seem to be costing them terribly in their polling right now. But they were trying to get on the front foot this morning, talking about migration, which very unusually at the moment in the polls, Labour is outpacing the Conservatives on. They're polling more favourably than the Conservatives on migration, which is a very unusual position for the Labour Party to find itself on. Obviously, there is always this question about what you're going to do about migration and are you going to cut it. Yvette Cooper, the Shadow Home Secretary, was doing interviews this morning, including with me on my LBC show, and I was pressing her and asking her, OK, you're saying you want to cut migration, but by when and by how much?
Well, we're not setting a target because every time the government has set a target, actually it's failed. They've made a mess of it. And also there is an issue about the figures in any one year can be affected by one-off things. For example, the pandemic meant obviously that net migration figures fell, but the Ukraine crisis and the war in Ukraine obviously meant that the figures increased because of the Homes for Ukraine scheme. But what we're saying very clearly is that net migration needs to come down. We've supported some of the measures that government has introduced in recent months, but we're going further by saying what we actually need is this plan for new requirements for workforce plans around health and social care, on IT, on engineering, on construction, on the key areas where there has been high levels of overseas recruitment because we don't have the skilled workers here in the UK.
But you're saying you want to cut net migration, but you're not necessarily even being clear whether you mean from year to year or from the start of the Parliament to the end of the Parliament or by how much. So a voter could look at this pledge and think, well, you could cut it by 1 or by 10 or by 50 or by 100 or by 1,000, and thereby you will be able to say that you've cut your pledge. I hear you've met your pledge. I hear you when you say the government has never met their perhaps unrealistic targets, but don't you have to give a little bit more detail than that?
Well, I understand, but I think it's really important to recognise that every time the government has set specific targets, it's failed. What we're doing is setting out clear areas. So, for example, on health and social care, on social care visas, the number of visas went up from 3,000 a year to over 100,000 a year, just in the space of 18 months. At the same time as what the government did was to halve the social care recruitment plan in the UK. So that's the kind of thing that where we need to take action, and we're setting up a new system within the law that will say where there are areas of higher levels of overseas recruitment, the Migration Advisory Committee will then work with Skills England, work with the Industrial Council, Strategy Council to say, right, in these areas, we will now have new plans to increase apprenticeships, to get people back into the workforce who are currently on long-term sickness, to make sure that sectors are recruiting
But sorry,
from
just
the UK,
to be specific,
not simply seeking visas from overseas.
To be specific, if you cut net migration by, say, 1,000 by the end of the next Parliament, you will have met your pledge.
That's clearly the objective that we're saying, is to make a significant difference and to make sure that net migration comes down. But I think, look,
but you're not going to say what significant means.
I understand that you would like me to set different figures and targets.
Significant is such a useful word, isn't it, if you're trying to get into power, because it says absolutely nothing, but it sounds as if it's the right direction of travel. And Lewis, you pushed her, and others did, for a number. And there's a very clear reason why she doesn't want to give a number, because it became an albatross, a millstone around David Cameron's neck when he first said we're going to try and get it down to 100,000. If you look at where the Conservatives are now, which is more than 6 times that, all Labour, in one sense, need to do is say it will come down, because, frankly, it's hard to see how it couldn't come down. Yeah. I mean, it is hard to see how 6 times higher than the original target of this batch Conservative prime ministers wouldn't be a good thing. But technically, I mean, if she reduces it by 5 people, by 10 people, she has brought immigration down. And I think at this point, she will get pushed on that, and there will have to be some kind of ballpark figure, because otherwise it sounds kind of ridiculous.
Do you know, I thought that the interview with Yvette today that you did, Lewis, it's a perfect emblematic sign of the Labour campaign, if you like, of the caution that our target is to do better. Oh, really? Okay, well, yeah, I would expect your target not to be let's do worse than the Tories. We're going to do better, but we're not going to put a number on it. And I just feel kind of, it's
even when
it is the cricket season at the moment. Labour are playing old-fashioned Test cricket, just the occasional single here and then, and Rishi Sunak is coming in and is having to knock the ball to the boundary and play baseball, because that's the only way the Tories have got a chance. And Labour being so cautious.
Jeffrey boycott.
Yeah,
it's
exactly.
It's Jeffrey boycott, dead bat, isn't it? All you have to do is stop it going anywhere.
Keir Starmer is Jeffrey Boycott, and Rishi Sunak is Stokes. I mean,
what are you talking about?
But the point is, okay, so I remember about a year ago, Tony Blair saying to me, he doesn't need to start giving figures. I mean, clearly this was a year ago, but that was their whole MO, that you don't actually need to give figures, you don't actually need to give prices or sums. And actually, when you look at what's happening in the polls, and it's obviously a mixture of things, not least to do with where the Tories have left immigration now anyway, maybe Keir Starmer's just reckoning. He doesn't actually need to do this at all. He just says, we're going to do better. We're going to do better. And people are so unhappy with the state of whether it's immigration numbers or NHS or waiting lists or whatever, that at the moment that works. It won't work once they're in power, if they get to power.
Actually, I mean, the Office for Budget Responsibility itself is forecasting that by 2028, net migration figures are going to come down to the 250, 300,000 mark. So it will have come down significantly just in terms of current policy, on the basis of current policy. So what Labour's basically saying is, we're going to basically do what the Conservatives are doing if they were keeping their current plans in, and we'll have cut it. So it's a sort of promise that I think they're reasonably confident that they can keep, as nebulous as it is. I mean, in terms of kind of the thing about of what you were just saying, Emily, in terms of the sort of Conservative positioning on it all, I mean, I think that takes us into the kind of position that they now find themselves in, right? Which is, I'm pretty sure that a big part of their decision, Number 10's decision to call this election, in the end, was partly about the fact that they were just worried and they were concerned that basically, with Parliament as it was, and without the kind of circus effect of a general election campaign, no one was listening to them. They were just finding it impossible to get any kind of message out there that was resonating with the public. So the gamble was, the roll of the dice was, that with a general election campaign, when the public's minds are inevitably more focused because they've got a decision to make, that they might be able to start to make some headway and cut that lead. I think what will concern them, I think Tory MPs were quite pleased earlier in the week that after a really shaky start to the campaign, the rain, the lack of the umbrella, the going to Wales talking about the Euros, the Titanic water, all of this stuff, actually during this week, they were pleased, they were staying on message, they were getting out policy ideas day after day, which were polling well individually, and Labour was kind of all over the place. They get to the end of the week, it's not made any difference. And so the concern, and where you'll start to see a bit of a real wobble if this doesn't change soon, particularly after the debate on Tuesday, is if that doesn't at least start to turn around, then people are saying, what the hell is the strategy here? But also, what could the strategy be? Because maybe, actually, they're still not listening to us even now.
Well, I think the debate on Tuesday is obviously critical, and I think that kind of just going back to my cricket metaphor, I mean, I suspect that Starmer will be very cautious. He wants to introduce himself to the British people, who probably, an awful lot of voters still have no idea who he is or what he's like, and therefore they kind of, he wants to do a bit of that.
And the worry for the Tories is they might like him. I mean, this is something that all their line throughout, obviously, this Parliament has been no one's keen for Keir Starmer. A lot of people, maybe it's odd for our listeners to understand, somewhat like unaware of the guy actually outside of an election, and maybe they see him and actually quite like him.
Totally. And so I think that for Starmer, that's his opportunity. Sunak has to do something that creates some noise, and yes, you're absolutely right. There have been a series of big policy announcements. They've spent a lot of money in the past week, the Tories, in a way that I think if Labour had done it and said, yeah, but we're going to just increase the tax take, people would have been ridiculing that. But look, the Tories have had a number of big policy announcements, and so far it seems to have made zero difference at all.
I think, going back to the debate for a second, when you do a daily podcast, there is an imperative on you to say something new every day. That is what we do. We have to come up with something new every day.
Or at least look like we are.
Or at least pretend to. But I think when Keir Starmer starts on that ITV debate, he will be, I think you're absolutely right, talking to people who've probably never heard of him or have seen much of him before. And actually, he will, I mean, dare I do a spoiler alert? We have already arranged a debate bingo card. I think the same phrases that we are all really familiar with will come up. He will barely have to say anything new. He will not say anything new, because for him, this is a first introduction to an ITV primetime audience alongside the Prime Minister. And if you're, the boycott, the dead bat, the Ming Vase theory is right, he won't take any risks there at all. He won't tell us anything new at all. It will just be son of a toolmaker. He probably will talk about his father. He probably will talk about some of the difficult things in his past a little bit, and then just force back the same messages that we've all heard really, consistently for 2 years.
Yeah, he'll talk about the pebble-dashed, semi-detached house in which he grew up, and he will anchor himself as this sort of lower middle-class guy who's done very well. And although he won't draw the contrast overtly, the contrast will be there with Rishi Sunak, who went to Winchester and married, the daughter of a billionaire, and who have tons and tons of money. And I think that and whose ex-teacher is now dead set against Rishi Sunak, because he says he squandered the power he was given. He should have known better. This was a sort of former Winchester, I think he was a maths teacher or an English teacher, who said, Rishi was a nice guy, but God, he squandered it. Now, you might say, of course he'd say that, they might have found one person in Winchester who is very happily sort of on the left voting side. But, when you've got people in Rishi's past that are coming out and saying this, it makes it a bit easier for the opposition leader.
My old maths teacher rang me up on LBC this week and said he was proud of me. So I've got much nicer teachers. I know. I've got much nicer teachers.
Have you actually done
Yeah, exactly. I actually did a little bit of long division finally. It only taken me sort of 30 years to finally actually do it on there. It was very long, the longest of long divisions. Talking about phrases that people keep repeating, all the sort of same old hackneyed stuff. What do you think Victoria Atkins, the health secretary, said to me when I asked her, when will the polls start to turn around?
Oh, I can't think. Is it the only poll that matters?
Is polling day. Got it in one. You're saying you're running a fantastic campaign, you've got the ideas on your side and so on, and yet the polls this week, despite the fact, as you say, Labour have had not exactly an easy week, showing no signs of turning for you whatsoever. When in the campaign can we expect to see a turnaround?
There's only one poll that counts, and that is polling day.
But you also know that your MPs will be very worried. They're facing wipeout on the basis of this polling.
Well, I have to say that is not the reaction that we are getting on the doorsteps, but we present our policies, we present our candidates with confidence and with integrity.
You're not concerned.
We are working our socks off to make this election campaign as positive as can be, given the rather negative outlook that the Labour Party has about the future of our great country. We're making it as positive as we possibly can about our country, because we refuse to descend into the misery that the Labour Party presents, the miserable picture.
You just said break glass in case of emergency. We've got a positive message. That's not the message we're hearing on the doorsteps. The only poll that matters is on polling day.
It's amazing, isn't it, that they're just knocking on all the doors of people who just happen not to have been polled. It's remarkable, really.
I want to talk a little bit about the poll that came out over the weekend. It's called a mega poll. I love a mega poll. I think it means that 10,000 is a lot. And this is from Electoral Calculus. And it was for the Mail Online and GB News. And it has, okay, take a deep breath here, okay, because it is just one poll. But it has Labour, on their current predictions, getting 493 seats. 493 seats. That is up 297. And with tactical voting, i.e. they ask people if the Labour candidate isn't sound, who doesn't have a chance, you know, where would you end up? Then it actually goes down for Labour and they're on 476, which is still a gain of 280. Now, I mean, I think we have to take every poll with a pinch of salt, a massive mountain of salt and all the rest of it. But I guess my question is just the impact that something like this might be having on the voter if they see it. If you were going to vote tactically and you see what a large majority Labour might be getting, are you now thinking, well, sod that, I don't have to? You know, are you thinking, I'm a lifelong Green supporter, lifelong Lib Dem supporter, I'm just going to go with my heart now because it all looks sort of too big to even worry about. Is that a danger for Labour?
They always get worried, terrified about complacency, and it just like they did in '97, you know, going around no complacency, Alistair Campbell and so on. They're doing that again now. I mean, this poll, I mean, if it did happen, obviously it's a massive if. I mean, 493 seats. I mean, Blair got 417, I think. So, you know, it would be way 18. Beating even that, I think it would be the biggest parliamentary majority since universal suffrage. I mean, it's kind of crazy. But I suppose the thing is, weirdly, actually, I don't know about the electors so much, but I think Tory MPs seeing polls like this, in a way, it's so cataclysmic that they don't quite believe it. And so in a way, if it were kind of just a bit better, they would almost feel like that would be worse for them psychologically.
We've still got 120 MPs in Parliament. Because we've done really well.
Because, you know, at the moment, look, I think if you said to your average Tory MP right now, if you said to them, you'll come out of this election with 200 seats, they would take that. Yeah. They would take that. They would be delighted.
This one, we should say, has the Conservatives without tactical voting on 72. With tactical voting, they then go down to 66. Okay, that is 7 more MPs than the Lib Dems. So this spectre of Keir as Prime Minister and Ed Davey as the opposition leader, I mean, I actually can't get my head around that.
Well, it would be the story of our lifetimes. I mean, it would be basically the kind of destruction of the Conservative Party. But I suppose the thing is, I mean, I don't think this is going to happen, but I suppose the thing about first past the post is that on the one hand, it has basically been the Conservative Party's best friend since universal suffrage for over 100 years, because it's basically always guaranteed. They've always had minimum 30% of the vote, 97, worst result, still got 30% of the vote. So they've always had at least 165 MPs. The thing is with first past the post is that although that's true, if you have a cataclysmically bad year and your opponents have a brilliant year, as the Labour Party found in Scotland in 2015, it is possible for you to basically lose all your seats if the gap is that big, or lose nearly all of them. And as opposed to in a PR system where, you know, if we had the current vote totals, the Conservatives get 20% of the vote, they still retain a big portion of the seats. So it's unlikely, but the weird way that first past the post works means that, as say the Canadian Conservatives found in the early 90s, it's not impossible. It can happen.
Look, I'm going to be the sort of voice of boring tedium and say, one poll, there are going to be a whole load of polls. We've got to take the average of the polls. But even if you take the average of the polls at the end of the first week of campaigning in earnest, where are we? We're where we started, with Labour still with a huge commanding lead.
And I guess the other thing to say is that any of these models only look at a kind of national swing. So once you start seeing individual seats, and I contacted Marwin, who's the guy that's done the electoral calculus poll, and said, just break this down. What happens when you have, for example, an independent? What happens when you have somebody who doesn't fit into your model, right? Southwest Norfolk, Liz Truss's seat, famously has this sort of, I don't know if they're still called the Turnip Taliban, but this sort of independent candidate who is more sort of traditional Conservative than Liz Truss and her sort of Carl Benjamin ways is now. And they're standing against her. And it is possible, I mean, highly unlikely, but possible, that vote is split 3 ways, between Reform, between the Independent, and between the Liz Truss supporter, and even in southwest Norfolk, even against a former MP, Labour could get that seat.
You want to be careful talking about the turnip Taliban where you are in Sussex. They'll be coming for you. There's going to be a few of them around there. I
Very,
guarantee.
very different.
By the way, it's hard.
Not turnip down there. No.
Turnip.
No. It's all sparkling wine down there, isn't it?
Olives,
Yeah. Half term's over. Do you think Ed Davey's coming back from Centre Parks yet, or do you think he's going to stay for another week? He's having a lovely time there.
He's having the time of his life. And I'm all for it, to be honest.
I don't know that he is. I mean, honestly, if somebody said to me, you've just got to do stunt after stunt after stunt. Do you remember when Richard Branson used to sort of dress up like a Pamela Anderson Coke bottle or dress up like a bride or whatever? I think somebody in his team is just going, come on, Ed, one more time down the water slide. Come on, put your head into a goat's face. Come on. Oh, it'd be really funny. Oh, come on, go and feed a llama. Obviously, I would love to feed a llama, but I think there must be a point at which, as the Lib Dem leader, you kind of want to stop doing stunts every single day.
I think he looks like he's had a good time though. So I don't know.
Where'd you go from here? Is the problem?
Yeah. Well,
where'd you go next? The cannon.
What happens if you have to talk about policy?
Yeah. Well, anything but that. Bring out the cannon, for Christ's sake.
Right. We'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
The Newsagents. This is a Global Player original podcast.